October 1951, late afternoon, Harlem, New York City. Albert Anastasia stepped out of a black sedan on 125th Street and did not look around. He did not need to. The men who mattered already knew he was there. Traffic continued to move. Storefronts stayed open. Conversations lowered, but did not stop. Anastasia adjusted his coat, crossed the sidewalk, and entered a neighborhood that was not his. He had come without an escort, without an announcement, and without permission. That choice carried weight. For 2 decades, Harlem had been governed by a man who did not answer to the 5 families, who did not ask for approval, and who did not tolerate surprises. Anastasia understood all of that when he walked in anyway. What followed was not a confrontation in the way outsiders imagine violence. It was something colder, a test of dominance conducted through restraint. By the time Anastasia left Harlem that evening, the balance between Italian power and black independence in New York had shifted in a way no meeting ever could. The ground rules of Harlem. By the early 1950s, Harlem was not a free-for-all. It was structured, regulated, and disciplined under Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Numbers banks ran on schedules. Protection was consistent. Disputes were settled quietly. Italian families did business nearby, but not inside without consent. This arrangement was not sentimental or symbolic. It was enforced through years of relationships, favors, and consequences that reached into police precincts, union halls, and back rooms across Manhattan. Harlem functioned because everyone understood where authority stopped. Anastasia knew these boundaries. Walking past them was deliberate. Johnson's authority had not come from a single act of violence or a brief alliance. It was accumulated over time, through patience and calibration. He learned early that Harlem could not be ruled like other neighborhoods. Too many eyes, too many loyalties, too many institutions layered on top of one another. Churches, clubs, civic groups, local politicians, small business owners. Harlem was dense with memory. Any disruption echoed. Johnson understood that power here had to be predictable. Not loud, not theatrical. Predictable. The numbers operation was the spine. It touched everyone without devouring anyone. Winnings were paid, losses were accepted. The books were clean enough to avoid unnecessary attention, and dirty enough to keep people invested. Protection followed the same logic. Merchants paid because the protection worked. When trouble came from outside, it was handled before it reached the street. When trouble came from within, it was corrected without spectacle. There were no public lessons. No bodies left to make statements. Statements were delivered in advance. Italian crews respected this not because they feared Johnson personally, but because the system around him was expensive to break. Selling in Harlem without permission meant more than a turf violation. It meant inheriting problems that could not be solved with a gun. Police responses were slower to manipulate. Informants were harder to plant. Community silence was thicker. A disrupted Harlem did not fragment. It resisted. Johnson maintained channels with the Italians, but never dependence. Meetings were scheduled. Agreements were narrow. Nothing open-ended. He allowed proximity, but denied penetration. It was understood that Harlem would not be used as a dumping ground for narcotics or a pressure valve for outside wars. If business needed to be done, it would be done elsewhere. If money needed to move, it would move around Harlem, not through it. This balance held because Johnson enforced it without improvisation. He did not bend rules for friends. He did not soften boundaries for profit. Men who tested him were not punished immediately. They were isolated, their access narrowed, their partners withdrew, their opportunities dried up. By the time consequences arrived, they felt inevitable, not personal. That inevitability was the real deterrent. Harlem's police precincts understood the arrangement, even if they never admitted it. Calls were fewer. Violence was contained. When something crossed a line, it was corrected before it demanded a public response. This made Johnson valuable in a way that could not be documented. Stability had currency. He traded in it carefully. Anastasia's name had reached Harlem long before his arrival. So had his methods. Johnson had listened without reacting. Reputation alone did not alter ground rules. Only behavior did. Anastasia's decision to enter Harlem personally signaled a belief that reputation could substitute for process. That belief had worked elsewhere. Brooklyn had folded to it. The docks had adjusted. Men had stepped aside. Harlem did not step aside. The rules were clear. They had been communicated for years without formal notice. No Italian crew claimed ignorance. No intermediary could plausibly misinterpret them. Walking into Harlem uninvited was not an act of curiosity. It was a challenge to the idea that Harlem governed itself. Johnson did not respond immediately, because the rules did not require urgency. They required consistency. The neighborhood continued to operate. Bets were placed. Shops stayed open. Meetings went on. That normalcy was the response. It signaled that nothing had changed simply because a powerful man had arrived. In Harlem, authority was not proven by entry. It was proven by endurance. Johnson had built a structure that absorbed pressure instead of reacting to it. Anastasia had walked into that structure expecting friction. What he encountered instead was resistance through continuity. That difference would matter. Albert Anastasia's reputation. Albert Anastasia did not rise through charm or patience. As underboss of the Mandano family and later a central figure in Murder, Inc., his authority was built on finality. When Anastasia acted, outcomes were permanent. He was not known for negotiation, but for correction. By 1951, his power was unquestioned in Brooklyn and the docks. Labor unions bent. Rivals disappeared. Men like Anastasia did not enter hostile territory unless they intended to leave having changed something. His presence in Harlem suggested a problem he believed only he could solve. Anastasia's reputation had been assembled piece by piece over decades through consistency rather than excess. He did not threaten often. He did not explain himself. When a decision was made, it was executed cleanly and without revision. This created a specific kind of fear, not panic, certainty. Men who crossed him understood that there would be no second conversation, no chance to recalibrate. The correction would arrive, and it would be sufficient. His influence on the docks was total. Control of longshoremen meant control of what moved and when it moved. That power extended far beyond stolen cargo. It dictated who could ship, who could receive, and who could make money without interruption. Union leaders were not intimidated through violence alone. They were isolated, replaced, or rendered irrelevant. Anastasia preferred outcomes that looked procedural rather than criminal. Firings instead of shootings. Votes instead of executions. The message traveled further that way. Murder, Inc. cemented his standing. It professionalized enforcement across families and cities. Killings were no longer emotional or reactive. They were scheduled, assigned, verified. Anastasia's role in that structure was not symbolic. He approved, he selected, he closed the file. The absence of chaos was the point. Violence that felt random drew attention. Violence that felt administrative did not. By the late 1940s, his name no longer needed explanation. It functioned as a warning embedded in conversation. When disputes escalated beyond resolution, someone would invoke Anastasia not as a threat, but as a conclusion. That was enough to end discussions. Men adjusted their positions rather than force a resolution that would cost them everything. But Anastasia's authority had limits shaped by geography and culture. Brooklyn responded to force because its power centers were fractured. The docks responded because their leverage depended on uninterrupted flow. Harlem was different. Its value was not logistical. It was social. Its economy was local. Its power brokers were embedded in daily life rather than industrial systems. Anastasia understood this intellectually. Whether he respected it was another matter. His approach to problems was linear. Identify the obstruction. Apply pressure. Remove resistance. That approach had never failed him. It had built an empire. It had erased competitors. It had trained entire organizations to anticipate his expectations. Harlem, however, was not obstructing him directly. It was simply refusing to engage. That refusal was more difficult to correct. Anastasia did not underestimate Bumpy Johnson as a man. He underestimated Harlem as a system. He believed that any system could be disrupted by removing enough pieces quickly enough. He had done it before. Cities had adjusted. Crews had folded. Entire operations had been restructured after his interventions. What he did not fully account for was how much of Harlem's order existed outside formal structures. Loyalty was not transactional in the same way. Information moved laterally, not vertically. Pressure applied in one place redistributed instead of collapsing. That made correction expensive. Still, Anastasia was not reckless. He did not arrive in Harlem with guns drawn or men in formation. He came in person because personal presence had always been sufficient. His reputation preceded him like an advance payment. Most men altered behavior before he spoke. Most territories softened before he entered. The expectation was simple. His arrival would prompt accommodation. A conversation would happen. Terms would be adjusted. Money would begin to move again. Harlem would acknowledge the reality that all power in New York ultimately connected back to Italian control. That expectation was reasonable based on precedent. What made Harlem different was not defiance. It was indifference. Anastasia had built his authority on making men feel small and exposed in the face of consequence. Harlem did not respond with fear. It responded with continuity. The neighborhood kept functioning as if nothing had changed. That reaction would force Anastasia to confront a possibility he rarely faced, that his reputation alone might not be enough, and that walking into Harlem did not guarantee that anything would move at all. The business that triggered the walk. The issue was not personal. It was transactional. A flow of money from Harlem had slowed. Numbers operations were operating without Italian participation. Dock workers tied to Anastasia were being bypassed. No tribute was coming in. From an Italian perspective, Harlem was benefiting from proximity without contribution. From Bumpy Johnson's perspective, Harlem owed nothing. The two positions could not coexist for long. Anastasia chose to resolve it in person, believing proximity would do what intermediaries could not. For years, the arrangement had been informal but functional. Harlem's money moved cleanly inside its own ecosystem. Italian crews focused elsewhere. The docks fed Brooklyn. The garment district fed Midtown. The five families understood that Harlem produced revenue differently and did not interfere as long as that revenue did not disrupt larger operations. But New York in the early 1950s was tightening. Federal attention was increasing. Margins were shrinking. Control over logistics mattered more than ever. Anastasia's power was rooted in movement. What crossed the docks passed through his reach. That leverage translated into influence over distribution, protection, and enforcement. When Harlem's operators began rerouting shipments, using independent truckers, local contacts, and non-union labor, it bypassed that leverage. It was not a rebellion. It was efficiency. But efficiency without tribute read as disrespect. From Anastasia's side, the concern was precedent. If Harlem could operate autonomously while sitting adjacent to Italian-controlled infrastructure, others would follow. Independence would spread. Influence would dilute. The system relied on the assumption that nothing in New York moved without permission. Harlem was proving that assumption wrong. Bumpy Johnson saw the matter differently. Harlem's economy did not rely on docks or longshoremen. It relied on trust, routine, and local circulation. Numbers money stayed local. Protection payments stayed local. When goods needed to move, they moved quietly through relationships that had nothing to do with Italian unions. Johnson had spent years building redundancy into Harlem's operations precisely to avoid external leverage. No single choke point. No single dependency. Messages had been sent before Anastasia arrived. Intermediaries spoke in careful language. Suggestions were made about cooperation, about aligning interests, about smoothing the flow. Johnson listened. He did not respond. Silence was not indecision. It was a refusal to renegotiate settled ground. That silence irritated Anastasia more than open defiance would have. Defiance invited correction. Silence suggested that correction might not be necessary. That was unacceptable. Power that went unacknowledged eroded quickly. There was also the matter of visibility. Harlem sat at the center of black political influence in New York. Journalists watched it. Politicians visited it. Any shift in control there would be noticed. From Anastasia's perspective, bringing Harlem into alignment would not just restore revenue. It would demonstrate reach. It would confirm that no neighborhood was exempt from Italian authority. Johnson understood that calculation. He also understood the risk of engaging it directly. Accepting Italian participation would mean accepting Italian oversight. Oversight would become expectation. Expectation would become obligation. Harlem would lose its insulation one agreement at a time. The conflict, then, was not about a missed payment. It was about jurisdiction. Who decided how Harlem functioned? Who set limits? Who absorbed risk? Anastasia believed that jurisdiction followed force. If he could apply enough pressure, Harlem would adjust. That belief had been validated across the city. Men changed their behavior when faced with sufficient consequence. Johnson believed jurisdiction followed legitimacy. Harlem accepted his authority because it delivered stability. Outsiders could not replicate that simply by demanding it. Any attempt to do so would destabilize the neighborhood and draw attention neither side wanted. As weeks passed without resolution, Anastasia concluded that intermediaries were no longer useful. They diluted intent. They allowed misinterpretation. A personal visit would clarify matters. His presence would compress the negotiation. Either Harlem would adjust, or it would reveal itself as a problem requiring a different solution. He did not arrive with an entourage because that would signal confrontation. He arrived alone to signal inevitability. The implication was simple. If he was there, the matter had reached its final stage. From Anastasia's perspective, this was a business correction overdue. From Harlem's perspective, it was an intrusion. Those two interpretations met the moment his car stopped on 125th Street, and nothing about what followed would unfold the way Anastasia expected. The arrival without permission. Anastasia's arrival was noticed immediately, not because he announced himself, but because no one announced him. That absence was the signal. Word moved faster than vehicles. By the time Anastasia sat down inside a Harlem establishment, Bumpy Johnson already knew where he was, who he was with, and why he had come. Johnson did not rush. He did not react publicly. He let Anastasia wait. In Harlem, waiting was not neutral. It was instructional. The car Anastasia arrived in did not linger. It dropped him and pulled away, blending back into traffic as if nothing unusual had occurred. That, too, was noticed. A man like Anastasia rarely traveled without layers of protection nearby. Leaving him alone suggested confidence or provocation. Either way, it drew attention. Men on the sidewalk adjusted their posture. Conversations shifted just enough to signal awareness without acknowledgement. Inside the establishment, nothing changed. Orders were taken. Cups were refilled. No one cleared space. No one offered a table out of deference. Anastasia chose a seat and sat. The absence of ceremony was deliberate. Harlem did not recognize authority automatically. It waited to see how it behaved. Anastasia did not fidget. He did not scan the room. He understood observation as well as anyone. He allowed himself to be seen without reacting. That restraint had served him elsewhere. It projected control. But in Harlem, control was measured by response, not display. Johnson received the information and continued what he was doing. He did not send a messenger. He did not issue instructions. He allowed the system he had built to operate without interference. That system did not escalate. It absorbed. Minutes passed, then more. Anastasia remained seated. The wait stretched without explanation. In other neighborhoods, this would have been an insult. In Harlem, it was calibration. It established hierarchy without words. The man who waited acknowledged the man who did not need to hurry. People came and went. Some recognized Anastasia. Most pretended not to. That pretense mattered. Recognition would have validated his presence. Indifference denied it. Johnson understood that public reaction was part of the negotiation. If the room bent, Anastasia would gain leverage. It did not. When Johnson finally arrived, he did not enter through a back door. He came in plainly, at his own pace. There was no entourage, no announcement. He did not look at Anastasia immediately. He greeted people he knew. He acknowledged the space before the visitor. That ordering was intentional. Only then did Johnson approach. There was no handshake, no greeting exchanged. The lack of formality stripped the moment of theater. It framed the encounter as a correction, not a summit. Anastasia spoke first. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He stated the issue as he saw it. Money had stopped moving. Arrangements had been ignored. This was not how New York worked. His tone suggested inevitability rather than anger. Johnson listened without interruption. He did not nod. He did not object. When Anastasia finished, Johnson responded briefly. Harlem was not part of those arrangements. It had never been. Nothing had changed. The exchange was quiet enough that only those nearby could hear. That was by design. Power did not need witnesses. Consequences would speak later if necessary. Anastasia pressed once more, not with force but with implication. Proximity brought responsibility. Stability required alignment. Johnson did not counter the logic. He countered the premise. Harlem's stability existed precisely because it was not aligned. Silence followed. Not tension. Assessment. Anastasia weighed the room. He understood violence. He understood intimidation. What he encountered instead was continuity. No one moved. No one reacted. The environment did not respond to him. That realization mattered. Any escalation would have to be overt. Overt action in Harlem would draw attention. Attention would invite scrutiny. Scrutiny would cost more than the original dispute was worth. Johnson did not issue a warning. He did not threaten retaliation. He simply made clear that nothing would change because a powerful man had arrived uninvited. Anastasia stood. He adjusted his coat. The movement signaled conclusion. He left the way he had come in, without interference, without comment. The lesson was not delivered through force. It was delivered through restraint. Harlem did not reject Anastasia. It absorbed him and remained unchanged. That outcome would echo far beyond that room. Bumpy Johnson's response. Johnson did not confront Anastasia in the street. He sent a message through presence. Men who did not speak Italian sat nearby. The room did not clear. No weapons were shown. The environment itself became the warning. When Johnson finally arrived, he did so calmly, as if responding to a routine matter. There was no handshake, no introductions, just acknowledgement. The balance of the room shifted, not because of force, but because everyone understood whose rules were active. Johnson's response had been shaped long before Anastasia ever stepped into Harlem. He had learned that overt reaction gave outsiders control over timing. It allowed them to dictate tempo. By refusing to escalate, Johnson reclaimed that control. He let the moment belong to Harlem, not the visitor. Everything about his approach signaled that Anastasia's presence was being processed, not challenged. The men seated nearby were not bodyguards in the traditional sense. They were fixed points, shop owners, runners, quiet enforcers whose authority came from familiarity rather than fear. Their presence communicated continuity. Nothing had been suspended because an outsider had arrived. Operations continued. Conversations resumed. The neighborhood did not hold its breath. Johnson understood that power expressed too visibly invited testing. Power expressed as routine discouraged it. The absence of tension was deliberate. It removed the oxygen that reputations fed on. Anastasia's history mattered less in a room that did not respond to it. When Johnson took his seat, he positioned himself deliberately, not across from Anastasia, not in opposition, but adjacent. This was not a negotiation between equals. It was a correction within an established system. The physical arrangement reinforced that interpretation without a word spoken. Johnson did not speak first because he did not need to. In Harlem, visitors explained themselves. Hosts listened. That order was not negotiable. Anastasia spoke because silence demanded it. Johnson allowed him to finish because interruption would have elevated the exchange. The response was measured. Johnson did not deny Anastasia's influence elsewhere. He did not dispute Italian power in New York. He confined the conversation to geography. Harlem had rules. They predated the current dispute. They would outlast it. That framing made compromise unnecessary. What Johnson did not say carried equal weight. He did not mention consequences. He did not describe retaliation. He did not threaten violence. Those omissions were intentional. Consequences that needed explanation were weak. Harlem's response, if provoked, would speak for itself. The room absorbed the exchange without reacting. That silence mattered. It meant Johnson did not stand alone. Authority in Harlem was distributed. It existed in shared understanding. Anastasia could remove a man. He could not remove a system without cost. Johnson's calm was not performative. It was functional. He understood that Anastasia's power thrived on confrontation. Removing that element reduced his leverage. The absence of fear was not disrespect. It was insulation. There was also a practical calculation. Any overt hostility would have forced Anastasia to respond to preserve his own standing. That response would have escalated the situation beyond control. Johnson avoided that by offering no visible challenge. He denied Anastasia a pretext. The exchange ended without resolution, because resolution was not Johnson's objective. He did not intend to renegotiate Harlem's position. He intended to reaffirm it. By treating Anastasia's visit as routine, he reframed it as inconsequential. Anastasia understood this. He recognized the structure in front of him, even if he did not share it. The lack of movement in the room told him that escalation would not isolate Johnson. It would mobilize Harlem. Johnson did not stand when Anastasia did. He did not follow him to the door. He remained seated, signaling finality. The meeting was over because Harlem had decided it was over. After Anastasia left, there was no discussion, no celebration, no instructions issued. The system resumed its rhythm without adjustment. That continuity was the response. Johnson had not outshouted Anastasia. He had outlasted him. He had demonstrated that in Harlem, authority was not asserted through presence alone. It was sustained through restraint. That understanding would shape what happened next. The conversation that wasn't a threat. The exchange was brief. There were no raised voices, no ultimatums. Johnson listened. Anastasia spoke plainly about business expectations. Johnson answered just as plainly about boundaries. He did not challenge Anastasia's reputation. He did not need to. Instead, he made clear that any attempt to enforce Italian authority in Harlem would require sustained occupation, not a visit. And sustained occupation would cost more than it would ever return. Anastasia framed the issue in terms of order. New York functioned because responsibilities were understood. Roots were respected. Revenue flowed through established hands. Deviations created instability. Instability invited attention. From his perspective, Harlem's independence was not defiance, but inefficiency. It created gaps in control that threatened the larger structure. Johnson did not argue the logic. He argued the applicability. Harlem was not part of that structure. It had never agreed to those terms. Stability in Harlem came from containment, not integration. The neighborhood remained calm precisely because it did not absorb outside conflicts. Anastasia suggested that isolation was temporary. Cities changed. Neighborhoods evolved. What worked in one decade failed in the next. Alignment was inevitable. Johnson did not dispute inevitability as a concept. He disputed its timeline. Harlem would change on its own terms, or not at all. The distinction mattered. It shifted the discussion from power to cost. Anastasia understood cost. Sustained occupation meant personnel, surveillance, corruption on a broader scale. It meant attention from federal agencies already watching Italian operations closely. It meant risking docks, unions, and supply chains for a return that could be matched elsewhere with less resistance. Johnson did not threaten those outcomes. He stated them as facts. Harlem's density made it expensive to dominate. Its social cohesion made it slow to fracture. Any force applied would reverberate outward rather than inward. Control would require constant maintenance. Anastasia tested the edges once more. He implied that refusal could be interpreted as disrespect. Disrespect required response. Johnson acknowledged that interpretation without accepting it. Disrespect assumed a shared hierarchy. Harlem did not operate within that hierarchy. The absence of threat was deliberate. Threats invited escalation. Escalation created winners and losers. Johnson was not interested in either. He was interested in preserving a system that already worked. By refusing to dramatize the conversation, he denied Anastasia a stage. There was a moment where silence stretched long enough to allow miscalculation. Anastasia could have pushed further. He could have raised his voice. He could have leaned on reputation. He did none of it. He read the room and adjusted. What he saw was not defiance, but resolve without hostility. That combination was dangerous. It offered no justification for correction, and no reward for persistence. Johnson's final words were not instructions. They were boundaries. Harlem would continue as it had. Business conducted elsewhere would remain elsewhere. No tribute would be forthcoming. No apology would be offered. Anastasia nodded once. The gesture acknowledged understanding, not agreement. That was sufficient. Further discussion would not change the calculus. The conversation ended without resolution, because resolution would have implied compromise. Neither side intended to compromise. The difference was that Johnson did not need to act to preserve his position. Anastasia did. As Anastasia stood, he weighed alternatives. Force would be visible. Pressure would be costly. Withdrawal would be interpreted as restraint, not weakness, if handled correctly. His reputation allowed for restraint without immediate loss of standing. Johnson remained seated. He did not watch Anastasia leave. He did not signal satisfaction. The absence of reaction denied the moment's significance. What made the exchange effective was what it avoided. No threats meant no challenges to respond to. No ultimatums meant no deadlines. The situation was left in a state of equilibrium favorable to Harlem. Anastasia left with clarity rather than victory. He understood the price of persistence. Harlem would not fold quickly or quietly. Any attempt to force it would damage interests more valuable than the revenue at stake. That understanding would shape his next decision, and that decision would confirm that the conversation, though quiet, had done its work. Why Anastasia chose to leave Anastasia understood violence. He also understood logistics. Harlem was not Brooklyn. The police were not aligned the same way. The community did not fracture easily. Any action taken there would be watched, remembered, and repaid in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. Leaving did not mean losing. It meant recognizing a terrain where dominance would require a different kind of war. Anastasia stood, adjusted his coat, and walked out the way he came in. He had already run the calculation before he rose from his chair. Violence in Harlem would not be surgical. It would spread. It would touch people who were not part of the dispute. That kind of disruption drew attention from places even Anastasia preferred to avoid. Politicians had eyes on Harlem. Newspapers had columns ready. Federal agencies had begun mapping Italian operations with increasing precision. A single visible act could unravel years of careful insulation. Brooklyn absorbed violence differently. Power there was compartmentalized. Pressure applied in one area rarely destabilized the whole. Harlem was compact, interconnected. A problem in one block rippled across 10. That made enforcement inefficient. It required constant presence, constant correction, constant risk. Anastasia also understood that Johnson's authority was not dependent on secrecy. It was open and accepted. Removing Johnson would not remove the structure beneath him. Someone else would step in. The rules would remain. Occupation would be required, not replacement. Occupation meant bodies, men on corners, money spent maintaining silence. Relationships cultivated under pressure rather than trust. Every dollar invested would return resistance rather than revenue. That imbalance mattered. Anastasia did not confuse power with stubbornness. Power knew when to redirect. There was also reputation to consider. Anastasia's standing allowed him to leave without explanation. He did not need to assert dominance in every room to maintain authority. His absence could be interpreted as discretion, as strategic restraint. Men who understood him would read it that way. Escalation would have forced Johnson to respond publicly. That response would have elevated Harlem's position. It would have turned a contained disagreement into a symbol. Symbols attracted allies. Allies complicated enforcement. Anastasia preferred problems that could be resolved quietly. Harlem was not quiet terrain. It amplified conflict. That amplification could not be controlled once initiated. As he walked out, he took note of what did not happen. No one followed him. No one hurried to explain. No threats were issued after the fact. The lack of reaction confirmed his assessment. Harlem was not afraid. It was insulated. That insulation was built over time, through consistency, through restraint, through an understanding of local dynamics that outsiders rarely mastered. Anastasia recognized that mastering Harlem would require learning its language, not imposing his own. The cost of that education was too high for the return on offer. Numbers money did not justify dock-level exposure. Tribute from Harlem would not compensate for the attention it would bring. Leaving preserved options. He could redirect pressure elsewhere. He could adjust shipping routes. He could reinforce other territories where returns were immediate and resistance minimal. Harlem did not threaten his empire. It simply refused to join it. Anastasia's departure was not an admission. It was a boundary of its own. He acknowledged that Harlem operated under a different calculus. That acknowledgment was rare. It was also practical. The street absorbed his exit the same way it had absorbed his arrival, without reaction, without ceremony. That symmetry mattered. It closed the encounter cleanly. Later, when others asked about Harlem, Anastasia did not dwell on it. He did not describe resistance. He did not recount the conversation. He let the absence of action speak. Those who understood power understood silence. Johnson did not pursue him. He did not claim victory. Harlem continued unchanged. That continuity was the outcome. Anastasia had tested the boundary and found it intact. Pressing further would have required commitment beyond reason. Walking away preserved balance. In New York, power was not measured by how often it was displayed. It was measured by how rarely it needed to be. Anastasia's choice to leave confirmed that Harlem was one of the places where restraint carried more weight than force, and that understanding would travel farther than any threat ever could. What Harlem learned that day, no one celebrated. There were no speeches, but the lesson spread. Italian power had limits. Harlem was not available to be claimed through reputation alone. Bumpy Johnson's authority was no longer just local knowledge. It was confirmed through restraint. Anastasia's decision to leave without escalation became proof that some territories were governed by systems stronger than fear. From that day forward, negotiations replaced assumptions, and Harlem remained untouched, not because it was invisible, but because it was understood. The lesson did not move through headlines or police reports. It moved through conversations held in measured tones, in barber shops, in back offices, in kitchens where business was discussed after doors were closed. Men spoke carefully, not because they were afraid of being overheard, but because they were acknowledging a shift. Something had been tested and held. Italian crews adjusted without formal instruction. Routes were reconsidered. Meetings were rescheduled elsewhere. The absence of enforcement in Harlem was not framed as retreat. It was framed as respect for boundaries that had proven durable. In New York, respect often followed demonstration rather than declaration. For Harlem's operators, the encounter reinforced a principle they had lived under quietly for years. Stability came from consistency, not dominance. Johnson's refusal to escalate had protected the neighborhood more effectively than any show of force could have. Violence would have invited retaliation. Retaliation would have invited scrutiny. Scrutiny would have broken the equilibrium. Restraint preserved it. Younger men noticed. They learned that power did not always announce itself. That authority could exist without spectacle. That the most dangerous response to provocation was often patience. Johnson did not teach this lesson directly. He allowed the neighborhood to observe it. There were also external observers. Politicians who relied on Harlem's calm took note. Police precincts appreciated the absence of disruption. Journalists found nothing to report. That quiet validated Johnson's approach in ways no agreement could have. The Italians did not disappear from Harlem's orbit. They remained present on the margins. Business still intersected when necessary. but the assumption of entitlement was gone. Future interactions were framed as requests, not expectations. That shift reduced friction across the city. Anastasia's choice to leave became part of the unspoken record. It was referenced obliquely. A nod here, a phrase there. Men understood what it meant without needing it explained. If Anastasia had chosen restraint, it meant force would not have worked cheaply. Harlem's insulation strengthened after that day. Operators reinforced redundancies. Relationships deepened. The system learned that it could withstand external pressure if it remained disciplined. That discipline was the real inheritance. Johnson did not leverage the encounter to expand. He did not press advantage. He did not seek recognition. Harlem's continued calm was his statement. In a city built on ambition, restraint stood out. The encounter also recalibrated how power was perceived across racial lines and organized crime. Harlem was no longer treated as a temporary holding space or an exploitable market. It was acknowledged as a jurisdiction with its own governance. That acknowledgment altered how negotiations unfolded elsewhere. Men who had assumed inevitability reconsidered. Power was no longer defined solely by reach. It was defined by resistance to absorption. Harlem had demonstrated that independence could be maintained without isolation. The lesson endured because it was practical. No one benefited from testing it again. The cost was clear. The return uncertain. In organized crime, that equation discouraged repetition. Years later, when circumstances changed and new pressures emerged, Harlem would face different challenges. But the memory of that day remained. It informed decisions quietly. It set limits without needing reinforcement. What Harlem learned was not that it was untouchable. It learned that it was legible, that its rules were understood and, when tested, respected. That understanding reduced the need for defense. Johnson's authority was not mythologized in the moment. It was accepted. That acceptance mattered more than reputation. It meant the system worked. Anastasia's walk through Harlem became a reference point precisely because nothing dramatic happened. In a world accustomed to blood as proof, absence became evidence. The city adjusted. Power redistributed subtly. Boundaries clarified. Harlem continued. That was the outcome. Not victory. Not defeat. Understanding.